So in terms of our goals, okay, for the course, this course actually has 3 goals. We're going to teach you how plants work. You may think you know how plants work, but this is going to be a kind of a detailed understanding of the form, function, and botanical diversity that's out there. We're going to be giving you the important evolutionary tool skills to be able then to kind of decode the book of life in terms of botanical diversity, okay? So this is all about how plants work, how their functioning came to be, and kind of the important attributes of plants kind of in general. Now, we also have 2 other very important goals. This course is a writing intensive class, okay? And as you'll see, there's going to be a class project as well as some written assignments within the class. And the writing kind of component then of our class actually has 2 major goals. And the first is that because we're a 300 level course, okay, we're no longer an introductory level course, we're gonna give you the critical and inquiring attitude of a scientist, okay? Because we're gonna give you the understanding of the scientific method, the basics of how to do science, but through the lens of botany and how plants work, okay? And the end goal of this is that we want to make sure that you're gonna have the ability to access, to read, and to articulate the findings of the scientific literature, okay? So we're gonna be actually delving into the scientific literature on plants, how plants work, various questions that you're interested in, and give you then the ability to utilize the scientific literature then for your own life or your own edification, okay? All right, those are our 3 main goals of the class. That's the real big picture, right? But in terms of our course goals, okay, we're gonna launch everybody here into the next level of biology and EEB, ecology and evolutionary biology. Okay, this is no longer an introductory course, okay? We're gonna give you the tool skills for the next level in your biological training. You're gonna know how plants work at the end of this course, and you're gonna be able to tell us quite a bit about their evolution. You're gonna know at the end of this course the essentials of plant anatomy, physiology, ecology, and evolution. This will basically give you your botany badge. You can go anywhere with this basic information, right? Kind of prime you for any sort of professional school, as well as a detailed understanding of the scientific approach, okay? Especially when it comes then to plants, okay? So who are we, okay? So me here, I'm floating down in the corner here. My name is Brian Enquist. Again, I'm a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. I actually arrived at the University of Arizona starting around in 2002, right after my postdoc. And my main goal kind of in life is to do really cool science that we consider not only fun, but very important, all right, for the world. We study botanical diversity and the role of plants in influencing ecological relationships, as well as trying to understand how climate change, human land use change influences the botanical diversity of plants. So let's soldier on here. Let me give you kind of an overview of some important kind of mechanical then aspects then of the class. So everything, well, most everything, but basically everything is going to be on our course website. Okay, so here's the URL right up here. You're going to be kind of living and breathing by this website. Okay, everything is going to be here. Your readings, your assignments, any sort of download, type options, your schedule, kind of everything. This is also going to be mirrored partly on D2L. We're going to be then using D2L for your grades, as well as, especially as we get going here, we're going to have recordings then of our class sessions then also available then on D2L. Okay, so I want to kind of highlight here in particular where the syllabus is. Okay, so we have an electronic syllabus. I'd urge you then to click on that. And I'm just going to highlight a few things because we don't have time to go over it in great detail, but this is your homework. Okay, I expect everybody to go through this syllabus. Okay. All right, so once you click that, then you'll get kind of the introduction to the syllabus and just scroll down, okay? It's rather large because the university requires us to kind of touch on many different aspects. If there's something that's missing there, if you have a question, let it be known, okay? So as we move through, I just want to highlight a few of the kind of key points of the syllabus, okay? You'll find more information there about who we are and our office hours, okay? So Jocelyn already mentioned that she's going to have regular office hours. I am also going to have regular office hours. We're going to start off, this is going to be on Zoom, okay? We'll see what happens with the university and university settings, but we'll start off with our Zoom kind of meeting times. There you'll also find more detailed course descriptions and objectives. So if you're still kind of a little unsure whether or not this class kind of like best meets kind of your goals, I would point you there to get a little bit more detailed kind of offerings, okay? This is a writing emphasis class, okay? As we move kind of forward, I think you'll have a better understanding of some of our expectations here for the writing emphasis component. We have some more text and more discussion on the syllabus about that. Textbook info. There are 2 textbooks for this course. We're also going to be using a lot of external literature. However, I have provided PDFs of basically everything, all right? Now, if you're like me, I love books, okay? I would encourage you, especially if you're interested in botany, ecology, and evolution, to have copies of these books. They're awesome. They're really great books. But on the website, if you'll notice, if you go then under our assignments and readings, you can download all the PDFs. I've made those available for you, right? For, listen, I was a student, books are expensive sometimes, and we can get these PDFs for you, okay? Okay, policies, attendance, academic advising, life challenges, physical and mental health. We have several bits of text and some thoughts then about that, and several very important links, so please check that out. Office hours, we've been in communication with that. Okay, look at your email, check out the syllabus. Attendance and exam policies. We'll have more to say about that later, but if you want to get kind of an overview, check out the syllabus. Classroom behavior, special accommodations, and services, okay? That's all covered. Again, any questions, let us know. That's all right. Here is kind of our overview in terms of grading, okay? So this is a quick breakdown. Now, I will tell you that this may change a little bit. So big picture. So this course then is going to have 2 major exams, a midterm and a final exam. We're going to have several different problem sets then that are due kind of throughout then the session. We're also going to have several essays based on reading of the scientific literature and popular press. Okay, and we'll have more to say about that as we move forward. But in particular, there is a term project, okay? And this is kind of based on writing a project proposal, okay? There's going to be a heavy writing component of this. There's going to be a final paper. There's going to be a final presentation as well. And this all evolves around and kind of circles around being able then to choose a scientific question, formulate a set of scientific hypotheses, go to the scientific literature of your interest, okay, questions of your interest, as it has to kind of focuses in on a botanical topic of choice, and then tries to address those questions and hypotheses based on reading and the scientific literature to figure out how scientists then are addressing and trying to answer them these questions, okay? We'll have a lot more to say about the term project, okay? So here's the breakdown of points and the final kind of percent of your final grade, okay? This is all in the syllabus, so if you have more kind of questions and things, you can kind of like delve in and look at it there, okay? All right, one last thing I want to kind of highlight on the course website itself is this little link and tab for assignments then and schedules. And if you look, there's a lot of other things here, but we're going to get to that kind of like later. So if you click on then on the assignments then on schedule, what you'll then find if you then scroll down is you'll find each day in kind of gory detail, okay? And each day there's not only the date here, but we're going to have the topics, okay? There's going to be a link for the lecture notes, as well as a link then for the lecture handouts, as well as a little kind of box here for the work that is due on that day, okay? So for example, notice we don't have anything to do today because it's the first day of course, but we do have some things that are due for the following then week. And we'll also be in communication in terms of email about these, but it is your responsibility to check to see kind of what is due then each day, okay? We also have then linked for the readings and then the items then that are due, all right? And if you notice here, you'll see several of these reading then assignments. If you click on those links, you'll actually see, you'll have copies then of the PDFs then for the readings, then of the material that we're covering, as well as the specific assignments, okay, then that are due, all right? So then for next class, we only have one thing due, and that is we want each and every one of you to set up your own Google Drive folder. Okay, that's going to be for this class, and you're going to invite both Jocelyn and myself to be a part of this. And we'll send out some more detailed instructions with this. This is one way we're going to be sharing material kind of across then everyone in the class. Okay, now one thing I want to point out here is that if you click then on the links, in particular the Lecture 1 handout, that's active now. So every lecture I have in handout for you, okay? It's a PDF. Now you can do, I guess, one of three things, all right? You can totally ignore it, and that's fine, all right? You're welcome to do that, but I highly suggest that you don't, okay? Or what you could do is you can use either a stylus on your, and then annotate then the handout on your laptop or on your tablet, okay? Or you can print it out and do it old school and then kind of write along then as you would like. And I have a few things then to say about that. So every course, class period, please make sure to check then the links so that you know kind of what's coming up and what's due. If you also notice then for today, I will after this also have links then for our lectures then online, okay? As well as the I'm recording all of this. So the in-class then session is then going to be on D2L, okay? All right, so kind of moving on. What are we going to cover? Well, we're going to cover quite a bit. All right, and I'm not going to kind of sugarcoat this. There's a lot of material, okay? Because at the end, we're going to know in kind of much detail in terms of how plants work, okay? But there's going to be a rhyme and a reason for kind of everything. So we're going to start with the important basics, and hopefully this is going to be a review for many of you. We're going to build your ecological and evolutionary toolkit, okay? I'm going to kind of go back and kind of emphasize the essentials, okay? So how you can begin then to build your lexicon for being a scientist, okay? So we're going to teach you the basics then of being a scientist, but from a botanical point of view, okay? We're going to cover the evolution and diversity of the major embryophyte clades, okay? Embryophyte, key word, we're going to cover that in just a little bit. We're going to talk about the evolution of plant tissues, organs, and their structure and function. We're going to cover whole plant integration. That is how all these different parts, these tissues, cell types, organs, all kind of interact in terms of kind of ultimately influencing their form, function, and diversity. We're going to be spending quite a bit of time on the evolution and diversity of photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is key, okay, because that basically kind of influences a lot in terms of how plants actually work. We're going to be talking about the constraints on plant biomechanics, plant gas exchange, nutrient exchange, and we're going to wrap all this up in terms of talking about functional diversity and ecology. Okay, so each class period, there's going to be a lot of different material, okay, that we're going to cover. So it's going to be very important that you keep organized, all right? And our lecture handouts then are a way for you to help kind of organize all of your thoughts then and thinking, okay? So there's going to be a lot of terminology, and we're going to try to ease in then to the terminology, all right? But in botany, they have another word for everything that you learn outside of zoology, okay? So we're going to cover quite a bit of terminology, but hopefully it's not going to be too onerous, okay? So, so each of these then links then for the course then are listed then on the website, okay? So why then is the lecture handout important, and why am I encouraging you to try to write along in the lecture handout? The lecture handout then is going to be my complete lecture slides, but there's going to be sections then that are blank, okay? Those blank sections then, and you'll see it if you start to download these, you'll get an understanding. Those blank sections are a way for me to emphasize to you what's important, okay? And so then by the physical process of actually filling in as we go through then this material on these blank sections then in my lecture notes, that's a hint for me telling you what's important. But then also many studies have shown that when you actually take notes, physically take notes, you actually do the writing. It can be on a stylus, okay? It can be electronically, or it can be physically pen on paper, okay? you remember it, right? You remember it much better than you do if you just sit there and listen, okay? So I highly encourage you to use the lecture notes as a way to, one, understand what I'm emphasizing as important, and two, to help you remember, okay? So I can't kind of underscore then that enough, okay? So a few kind of notes here. Also, if you want to print them out, okay, you're gonna have a lot of sheets of paper kind of at the end. That's fine. I'd encourage you to organize all of your notes either electronically or in paper. Use a 3-ring binder or careful kind of digital kind of curation. All right, awesome. So plants are amazing. They're cool. They're diverse in their form and their function. Okay, so in terms of our course, in terms of how we're going to be kind of focusing then today, we want to try to understand why they're incredibly diverse, okay? We're going to be taking an ecological and evolutionary perspective in terms of why they're so diverse. And in particular, one kind of aspect that makes plants a little bit kind of boring is that they just sit there, right? Now, plants are sessile. We're going to go over to the term what actually sessile means. But I'm showing you here a video from the BBC. And so this BBC video actually took several kind of time-lapse photography of several plants, including an entire forest, kind of within then this woodland within England, and they stitched them all together. And what is fantastic then about this is that they can compress the time span of a growing season in a very short period of time. And you can watch then how these plants kind of go and grow and compete themselves, kind of forage then for light, interact with each other, how they grow in terms of not only flowers, but also leaves, and how they interact with each other, okay? So plants are quite dynamic in many different ways, but unfortunately, because the timescales of our human existence, it's hard for us to actually appreciate the fact of just how dynamic plants actually truly are, okay? So as we then kind of move forward then into the course, we want to then ask something about this diversity, all right, in terms of the diversity of form then and function. And in particular, we want to start understanding some basics in terms of how we characterize this diversity in form and function. So what I'm showing you here is one example then of just a typical flower. This is a typical sunflower, okay, or a daisy. And within the daisy family itself, we can find a tremendous amount of diversity, right, in terms of flower size. Okay, so we can talk about diversity in multiple different ways, in terms of species composition, but also in terms of flower size, okay? So here we're showing you a ginormous kind of sunflower head, and actually one of the smallest known flowers of the sunflower family, smaller than a penny itself, right? So quite dramatic in terms of differences in size. Again, this relates ultimately to differences in functional diversity. And plants are pretty amazing too, because gosh, they are enormous in terms of size. So one kind of interesting fact that you may not be aware of, but the largest organism on Earth, the largest single kind of integrated functional organism on Earth is actually a plant. It's the giant redwood in California. In fact, it's an order of magnitude larger than the largest animal on Earth, the largest animal that has actually ever existed on Earth, and that's the blue whale. So plants blow away totally in terms of their functional diversity, in terms of their size. And just kind of for scale here, I'm also showing you one of the smallest land plants, in particular the smallest flowering plants. This is duckweed or lemna. You'll often see this as kind of this greenish scum that's kind of growing on ponds, but that's actually a small flowering plant, okay? So tremendous variation in size. In fact, we say 9 orders of magnitude in size. And so remember, an order of magnitude is a factor of 10. So that's 9 factors then of 10, okay? So why then are plants important? Plants are important because all of life effectively depends on plants. Now, plants are autotrophs. This is one of these terms that we introduced kind of earlier, and I want you to think about. An autotroph is an organism that makes its own food, okay? And in particular, the process then of how plants make their own food is something known as photosynthesis, okay? But if you just step back a little bit, all of life, including our lives, our human economy, our subsistence, as well as every animal, kind of insect, mammal, bird that you see on the planet, all ultimately depends on what then plants ultimately do, okay? So you may have some kind of intuitions in terms of the importance of plants, things like pollination, right? Importance to insects, birds, mammals, and so on. But the role of plants then in the Earth system is much more important than you may know. But in particular, to our own human society, agriculture, okay? Our economy, all right? The development then of human societies, all closely tied then to plants, how plants work, okay? Their physiology, and how to propagate them, okay? So our livelihoods ultimately depend then on plants and kind of how plants work, right? And so from a pure agricultural and applied then setting, we need to know some basics of how plants work, okay? Anywhere you go on the planet, the relationship between people and plants is an incredibly close and intimate one, and one that has shaped then human history, human economies, and kind of the dynamics of human interactions across the globe. Okay. Now, I'm also showing you here a little animation, okay? And what this animation is the metabolic rate of the planet, basically. And I'm only showing you the terrestrial world. We're not looking at oceans, but we're kind of concerned mainly with the land plants here. And so on this map, you're going to see these areas of kind of white and areas of green. And if you'll notice here down on the ticker tape, as it's kind of scrolling through, we're scrolling through each day, each month, and then slowly we're going to progress them through the years. So what is this? All right, well, what you're actually looking at is the net ecosystem primary productivity. This is the assimilation of carbon dioxide into the terrestrial environment via plants. And we're looking at the intensity then of photosynthesis across then the globe and how it varies within each year and between years. And if you notice within each year, you'll see this greening up of the Northern Hemisphere, and kind of opposite then to that, you'll see a little greening of the Southern Hemisphere as well. Now, because the Northern Hemisphere is so large, that's when then we see this big greening up in the Northern Hemisphere. This is the summertime, okay? When plants then put on their leaves, all right, when the snow melts, and then we're getting then the onset of photosynthesis in the Northern Hemisphere, okay? Now, there's several different ways for us to kind of measure then the impacts then across the planet. And I want to kind of give you another kind of animation then of the metabolic rate of the planet. And this has to do with, if we kind of rescale that map in terms of how much photosynthesis then is occurring within different parts of the planet. And so if you notice, you'll kind of pick out different continents. Here's South America, Africa, Asia, and here's a little Europe and North America here. But we're rescaling the size then of these different countries and the different continents based on how much photosynthesis is occurring there. Now we're going to animate that annual metabolism of photosynthesis as we then move forward. And I'll just kind of move it forward here. And so we're rescaling the size of photosynthesis in terms of when it happens in then the different months, right? So notice it looks like a little bit of a heartbeat, right? This is the seasonality then of photosynthesis, going from the Northern Hemisphere to the Southern Hemisphere and so on. So plant metabolism as measured by photosynthesis is highly variable then across the globe, but also it differs in terms of the timing of within the year. Okay, so we have seasons, and that seasonality is very important. Okay, so literally you're looking at the heartbeat of the world, because all of that photosynthesis, all of that energy then that's captured then from the sun in terms of plants, that enters the terrestrial biosphere and that fuels everything that happens in the biosphere. Okay, so in moving forward, why is this important? So I want to introduce you to something known as the Keeling curve, okay? And so here actually is Charles Keeling, right? He actually won the National Medal of Science, and here he is kind of accepting then this medal. He accepted then this medal because of his work on monitoring carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so he started doing this work right before 1960. And they chose then a location on the planet where they thought that the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, which they wanted to measure accurately, They wanted to find a location that was kind of impeded and messed up then by pollution in the air or any sort of kind of inner workings of kind of the industrial kind of outputs then of human societies. And if you'll actually notice as you go from, this is years then on the bottom, as you go from around 1960 then to present day and measure the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, what they actually found was that in each year, if you look really quickly here, that there's this little up and down. And so I'm zooming in on one kind of year, okay, of daily CO2 concentrations, then within the atmosphere, as measured from the top of this volcano on the top of Hawaii here, the Mauna Loa volcano. And so what they actually find within a year is that CO2 concentrations, as we go from May, June, July into then October and November, CO2 concentrations in a given year will decrease, but then they start to increase after October and then go into then the next year. And if you notice, each year is like this. There's this up and down of CO2 then concentrations. This is reflecting that metabolic photosynthetic heartbeat then of the planet. As the northern hemisphere then goes into springtime and summertime, all those leaves come out in the northern hemisphere and all that photosynthesis actually sucks down CO2 in the atmosphere. This is incredible. You can actually measure this. But then once summertime is over in the northern hemisphere and the leaves then are shed and those plants are no longer performing photosynthesis, we get this increase in CO2, mainly coming from biotic respiration. But the big insight from Charles Keeling is that over time, CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere has risen each year and gradually increased, and they're increasing to this day. This is due to greenhouse gas emissions, okay? So immediately what you can see is through the lens of carbon dioxide, there's the important interplay of what plants do. So plants can actually scrub the atmosphere of CO2. You see that every year, but also the role of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this is a little ironic because all the CO2 that's being released from greenhouse gas emissions, where that ultimately came from, is ancient photosynthesis. So within a year and between years, all this dynamic of CO2 in the atmosphere is due on some level to photosynthesis, either current photosynthesis or ancient photosynthesis. We'll have more to say about that. Okay, why are plants also important? Well, I don't have my cup of coffee here because it's a little late in the day, but this is probably the main reason why I love plants. They are chemical wizards, okay? Secondary chemistry. We're going to be talking about secondary chemistry. Here I'm showing you several different chemotherapy drugs. These are all the result of secondary chemistry, which is ultimately the result of coevolutionary processes between plants and animals. And so coevolution turns out to be quite important. Okay, so plant form and function 101. So I'm going to go through in just this one little slide in about 5 minutes. We're going to go over the basics of what a plant does. Okay, it's actually much more complicated than this, but this is the basics of how a plant works. Okay, so what a plant is, and you have to love my lovely drawing here, is a plant then is this interface between the soil and the atmosphere. Okay, so I'll say that one more time. The plant then is this interface between the soil and the atmosphere. And it is literally a wick, okay, as in a candle has a wick, you know, that's where you light the candle and, you know, the flame comes up, you know, on the wick. That wick, what it does on a candle is actually provide a conduit between the wax, and when the wax melts, that wax travels up then the wick, and that's what burns, that's what keeps then the flame on a candle going. Well, a plant is very similar. No, there's no fire. We're not letting it on fire here. But really what the plant is doing is it's providing then a conduit between a concentration gradient. And we call that a water potential gradient. So a plant utilizes a water potential gradient between the soil and the atmosphere. In the soil, there tends to be a high concentration of CO2 in the soil. Soil tends to be wetter. In the atmosphere, there's a low concentration then of water. So the plants then utilize this natural gradient in water availability to then provide this potential energy to fuel then their metabolism. And what makes plants unique is that they're assimilating CO2. Now, actually, it turns out that there are many other organisms that assimilate CO2, via photosynthesis. And we'll get into that in a little bit when we talk more about photosynthesis. But for the land plants in particular, they utilize CO2 in order then to fuel their respiration, grow, and reproduce. This is photosynthesis. So this is the basics: utilizing a water potential gradient, assimilating then CO2 in order then to maintain homeostasis and to grow. Now we can talk about the form and function in different environments. And because the environment varies in terms of temperature and water availability, and even concentrations of CO2, because of that, we get a lot of our diversity, okay? So this is plant form and function 101, okay? The basics of how a plant works. And most of the class is going to be delving into a lot of the details and how actually all of this really happens. Okay, now for any plant, all right, any plant is going to be kind of obeying four unique functions, okay? There's some exceptions here. But in general, we're going to be talking about 4 kind of unique functions of all land plants, all right? And so if you notice, I'm kind of mixing 2 different terms here: land plants and this mouthful word here, something known as the embryophytes. And we're going to be spending more time kind of talking about this difference between embryophytes and the land plants. So all plants have to perform functions of photosynthesis. All plants have to reproduce, okay, in order to remain viable. They also have to maintain functions of hydraulics, that is water movement, okay? So we're gonna be talking about how water is transported, how water is absorbed, and how it's exchanged then with the environment, which has to do with ultimately evaporation. But also plants have to withstand kind of the vagaries then of the environment. And in particular, they have to not only stand up, okay, but they have to take a lot of abuse of the environment, because of which we have to talk about mechanics and a little bit of biomechanics here in terms of dealing with gravity and wind and kind of all the onslaughts of what it's like to be a static kind of plant living in a given environment. Okay, so the 4 functions: photosynthesis, hydraulics, reproduction, and mechanics, okay? That's gonna help kind of guide kind of everything as we move forward then within the course. Okay, so whole plant structure and function then is going to be then guided then by photosynthesis, mechanical stability, hydraulic transport, and reproduction. And all of these functions are going to be governed by physical processes. That is, we can talk about things like zero-sum dynamics, different equations. We're going to be utilizing a few physical equations, in particular something known as the Hagen-Puccio law, Fick's first law of diffusion. All of these provide the foundation for understanding how plants work. So we will be covering a little bit of equations, doing just a little bit of math, but hopefully don't be scared. This will be pretty gentle. Okay, so I'm kind of like moving forward here. We want to start thinking in terms of what's kind of fundamental kind of about all plants in terms of how they work. So we've already mentioned photosynthesis, okay? And we're gonna focus on the fundamental importance of photosynthesis in fueling plant metabolism, growth, and reproduction. And when you take introductory biology, you often learn kind of the general equations for photosynthesis and maybe a little bit about the variability then in photosynthesis and how it may differ across species. But we're gonna go into detail in terms of the evolution of how photosynthesis then came to be, but also we're going to touch on many aspects that actually photosynthesis is incredibly diverse in terms of how different plants then use different carbon exchange then pathways. And we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail. So leaves are pretty cool because these then are the fundamental units of how most plants basically operate, okay? And within the leaf, you can kind of use it as kind of viewing the soul then of how a plant works. And if you strip away that outer kind of cuticle and actually expose the true kind of inner working of a plant, what I'm showing you here is actually an X-ray. It's a detailed X-ray of an aspen leaf. And you can see this venation network, right? And it's beautiful. And this is the transportation network then of the leaf. And in this transportation network, water then is being pulled basically from the soil all the way up to the leaves. And that water then is being exchanged with the atmosphere. And in that exchange with the atmosphere, CO2 is also being assimilated via photosynthesis. And there's some amazing biochemistry that happens that ultimately results in sugar, carbohydrates, things that are used to fuel not only the metabolism of the plant, but the rest of the metabolism then of the biosphere. And all of that occurs within this little transportation network called the venation network of the leaf. Okay, so that is where a lot of the action occurs. And we're going to be delving into some details of the biochemistry and what actually occurs then within the leaf and how this gets put together with the leaf, the stem, the roots, and so on in terms of how plants work. Okay, cool. All right, moving forward. All right, so photosynthesis. This may be a review, but we're going to spend time in class focusing on the two major components of photosynthesis. The first major component of photosynthesis is something known as the light harvesting reaction. Okay. And I'm actually showing you some recent research here where they have taken then all the different molecules and all the biochemistry together and given you a 3D kind of image of what the light harvesting reaction kind of complex actually looks like. It's actually beautiful. All right, we have hundreds of molecules interacting then with each other to form then these different structures. It's actually a physical structure that is finely tuned to extract energy from the sun. This is the first and really the only solar panel on Earth. Okay? And it's specifically tuned to take specific radiation from the sun and turn it then and capture it into chemical energy and make the plant work. Okay, so we're going to go into details then about how the light harvesting reactions actually work and what is actually universal about the light harvesting reactions, because it's actually kind of critical for understanding if you want to know basics of agriculture, crop breeding, kind of genetics. We need to know some basics of how the plant works. Okay, now there's a second set of reactions that also occur then within photosynthesis. There's not only the light reactions, but there's also the carbon reactions. And so what I'm showing you here is a very simple cartoon of a chloroplast, okay, which is an organelle within the cell. We're going to be spending some detail and some time kind of talking about kind of plant cells, but also inner workings of chloroplasts, and then where the light reactions, and then the second set of biochemistry, which are known as the carbon reactions. You may know these from as either the Calvin cycle or the PCR cycle, or the carbon reactions as well. Now, a lot of very important chemistry, biochemistry occurs here, but in particular, one important player, an important enzyme that basically rules the metabolism of the earth, something known as rubisco. Okay? Rubisco is quite key in terms of not only of its evolution, but also some of the key constraints in terms of this key enzyme and how it interacts with carbon dioxide, as well as these other very important molecules kind of associated with the carbon reactions. So we're going to be going into a little bit more detail kind of early on in the class in terms of light reactions and the carbon reactions. Okay. Now we're going to try to take this understanding of how plants work and put it within an evolutionary understanding in terms of the origin of plant diversity. And in particular, we're going to be focusing on kind of developing our key kind of evolutionary terminology in terms of land plants. And in particular, we're going to be focusing on a group of plants known as the embryophytes. I mentioned this term a little bit, but these are the land plants, okay? Now we're going to be mentioning cladistic terminology. In particular, we're going to be focusing on the clade of plants known as the embryophytes, but also we're going to be spending a lot of time with another clade of plants, which is a subclade within the land plants, a group of plants known as the tracheophytes or the vascular plants, okay? So immediately I've now introduced two major groups of plants. These are clades, okay, within the land plants. So the first group of plants, something known as the embryophytes, and the second group of plants, something known as the tracheophytes. And we're going to be going into, again, more detail on these major groups of plants. So we're going to be doing things in terms of kind of building our evolutionary kind of lexicon, okay? And we're going to be learning how to use cladograms or phylogenies. Phylogenies are hypotheses, okay? They allow us to make sense then of the diversity of the earth, okay? As well as kind of understand evolutionary history, as well as understand the ultimate evolution of land plant diversity. Okay, and we're going to be using phylogenies to make sense of the evolution of specific traits, evolution of photosynthesis, evolution of water use, and so on. And so I'm going to introduce right now a few terms, okay, that I would like you to kind of take to heart, okay? And a sub kind of group, I'm sorry, kind of a sub area of biology, something known as cladistics, is the study of evolutionary relationships then within plants and animals, but the ability to then group species into higher taxa or clades. Okay, and so we're going to be focusing a lot on clades, and there's going to be many reasons why we focus on clades. Clades are important in particular because clades consist then of all taxa that share one common ancestor. And the origin of cladistics and cladistic thinking goes back to the scientist known as Willy Hennig in 1966. Okay, Willy Hennig basically kind of formalized a way of cladistic thinking, right, in biology. So thanks to Hennig, we now have a way of kind of making sense of the complexity of the biological world. So a clade then are all taxa that share a common ancestor, okay? And so we're going to be going into detail in terms of the basic phylogeny then of the embryophytes, as well as other groups of plants. So don't worry so much about kind of understanding then this first phylogeny, because we're going to be walking through in detail the first kind of major clade that we're going to focus on, and that is the embryophytes. Okay, so why are we going to be using phylogenies? We're going to be using phylogenies to help us understand and organize general aspects of plant diversity and the history of life. Okay? They're going to help us understand and simplify some of our understandings of not only how plants work, but also how they came to be so diverse in their form and function. And we're going to use phylogenies to help address evolutionary and ecological questions related to the evolution of plant form, function, and diversity. Okay, so we're going to be seeing quite a bit of phylogenies, but to start with, we're going to be giving you the lexicon and the tools to be able to basically utilize phylogenies. Okay, so what I would like to do in our last about 15 minutes here is I want to introduce kind of 5 central questions that we're going to return to at the end of the course. And these 5 central questions then they're going to be interrelated, but they're going to be also central to helping us kind of put together all the bits and pieces of the information then that we have. And they're going to be central to a lot of the key kind of cutting edge questions in science that we're going to be asking kind of currently. So we're going to be wrestling with questions that are very much timely because a lot of science today is focused on these questions. Now, these questions, they're going to appear on the final exam in some form, all right? And I'm going to kind of show you them here because they're going to kind of give you a sense of where we're going to go, okay? So the first question is, what controls the evolution and distribution of plant diversity? Okay, so this is a big question. So we want to understand why plant diversity varies, not only in space and time, why there's so many species in some locations, why there's so few, and kind of what controls that, okay? So that's going to be kind of our first kind of major question. All right? So diversity. We want to understand something about how we classify diversity, why plants are so diverse, and how they came to be that way. All right. I'm going to jump ahead to our second question here. And so our second question is, what have been the important constraints that have shaped the evolution of plant form, function, and diversity? Okay. So it actually turns out that if you look at the diversity of plants across the globe, it looks like, gosh, you know, there are a lot of different plants. There's, gosh, tropical trees and grasslands, and we have saguaros and weird shaped cacti and so on. But it turns out that there's a rhyme and reason for why plants look and work the way they do. It's not just hodgepodge and random out there. There are very important reasons why plants look the way they do and why they work the way they do, okay? And so we're going to be focusing on several of these important constraints that have shaped then the evolution of plant form and function. All right, so we're going to talk kind of immediately about a lot of different constraints. Now, this is kind of interesting because, I'm sure a lot of you have houseplants. I do too. I happen to kill them all because, gosh, I forget to water them. I put them in bad locations in the house and they tend to die for lack of light. But all plants in general have to compete for limiting resources in order to grow and maintain homeostasis and reproduce. And so we use the term fitness then to describe then how well plants do in an evolutionary sense. So all plants have to deal then with constraints of the environment, constraints then of how they work, that then limit how actually they can acquire resources from the environment. And because of which that kind of limits their form and function. So a constraint, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about what constraints are, but I can kind of give you some foreshadowing. A constraint is any physical or biological process that limits the phenotype possible for organic evolution. It kind of limits what's possible, okay? And once you know what's impossible to make, or what's highly unlikely, that actually gives you a lot of predictive ability in understanding not only how plants work currently, but how they worked in the past and how they'll work in the future. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna just skip forward a little bit to the third question. The third question then has to do with understanding how one clarifies similarities and differences between plants. So we want to understand on a basic scientific level, how then do plant species or plant taxa or clades differ from one another? What would you measure in order to understand how they differ from one another, but also how are they similar, okay? And in order to answer then this question, it's going to require some understanding of how to use phylogenies and how to use cladistic thinking, but also to understand some basics in terms of kind of the universals of how plants can work, okay? So for example, you can just look at leaves, plant leaves. One would think that naively, there should be maybe one or just different types of leaves, maybe a few different types of leaves. But in general, if you just look out and start collecting leaves, right, something that I do all the time, there's a tremendous diversity of leaves. So why is that? Why do leaves differ then in their size, their shape, okay, but also their functioning? Those differences are reflecting actually some very important signals of evolutionary, anatomical, and physiological and ecological trends that have happened on the planet. And they help you, being able to understand those differences helps you decode and read the book of nature in terms of what actually happened to generate that diversity, but what that diversity is actually telling you about how plants actually work. Okay, so we can talk about evolutionary divergence in physiology, anatomy, and life history, okay? So we can talk about these differences. Now, we can also talk about similarities and convergences. So we're gonna be talking about evolutionary convergence in form and function. And there's actually remarkable convergence in terms of how plants work in their form and function, despite enormous anatomical and physiological differences then between plants. And I can kind of give you one kind of foreshadowing in terms of how we look at that. So what I'm showing you then here are a bunch of cool plants, okay? Got kind of a conifer tree here, all right? We have a tree fern, nice palm tree, have a nice oak tree here, all right? These are all similar in terms of the fact that they're trees, more or less. They're tree-like, okay? They're big. They have kind of one central stalk or a trunk, bunch of explosion of leaves then on the outside, okay? They got big, right? So we see this remarkable convergence. They're similar, they're tree-like, okay? But what's remarkable is that if you cut them open and if you actually look to see how they work and slice their trunks open, what you actually find is that how they work on the inside, their physiology, how they transport resources, how they actually grow and how they put together this tree-like structure, totally different. It's like seeing a bunch of different types of cars on the road, and then stopping them all, and you open up the hood and you look at what's powering them in each different type of car on the inside. It's not, one may have an engine, but one may have, I don't know, something completely different, totally different ways of building the internals of how a car actually works. The same thing with the tree-like structure. Many different ways to be a tree in terms of how the physiology and how the anatomy and how the growth actually works. But the end result is something similar, a tree-like structure. Okay, so they're convergent in the tree-like form, but coming from very different pathways and many different ways of getting there. Okay, fourth question. What are the abiotic influences on how plants function in their environments? Okay, so we want to know something about the abiotic environment. That is the physical template, the local temperature, the soil conditions, availability of water, rainfall, snowfall, so on, how that abiotic environment influences how plants work in their different environment. So we want to understand how plants interact with the environment, okay? And how does that relate then to their functional diversity? Okay. Now it's kind of a paradox, right? So you all have houseplants for the most part. And with your houseplants, they're all kind of different, but in general, all plants need water. Maybe they need a little bit of nutrients and they need light, right? All plants are very similar. So the paradox is, why are they so diverse? How come there isn't just maybe one or just a few different types of plants? They all need water, light, nutrients, right? How come there isn't just one way of doing it? Why are they so diverse? So part of the answer to why they're so diverse is that the distribution of limiting resources in the abiotic environment is spatially and temporally heterogeneous. And because of which there are different strategies to deal with a variable environment, okay? So we're gonna be delving into this paradox of how come there isn't just one plant? Why are they so diverse, okay, within the class itself, okay? So then skipping ahead, the last question kind of builds on the fourth question. So the fourth question then focused on the abiotic environment. The fifth question has to do with the role of the biotic environment, the role of how plants interact with other living species. In particular, what's been the role of biotic interactions in shaping the evolution of plant diversity and vice versa. It turns out that coevolution between plants and animals is extremely important, not only for plants and the diversity of plants and how they work, but also on the animal side as well. So coevolution with fungi, insects, birds, mammals, us, okay, critically important. Symbiotic relationships, mutualistic, positive relationships then with different animals, different species. Parasitic interactions with not only insects, but also fungi and so on. Herbivory, the process of animals eating plants. This has resulted in what we know as secondary metabolism, secondary compounds. This is the equivalent of coevolutionary chemical warfare between plants and animals. This is where we get all of our drugs from plants, from secondary compounds. Pollination, seed dispersal, mutualisms, all important. Okay, so I've covered 5 separate questions in class. And at the end of each class, okay, well, each recorded lecture anyways, I'm gonna have a series of different questions for you that kind of test your understanding of the material, but also another chance for me to point out what I would like you to remember, okay? So I have 2 ways of trying to kind of emphasize a few parts then of the lectures in terms of getting you to kind of emphasize some points to remember. That is on the lecture handouts and kind of following along the lecture handouts, as well as the end, I'll have some questions here for you. So here are some basic questions. So you should be able to define for me some basics of what is cladistics and who is the founder of cladistics. Hint, it's Willy Hennig, 1966. So I have some additional questions here that I didn't have time to cover because I had to go a little quickly because of time, but we're gonna get into these questions here later on. So if I didn't cover it, in particular Fick's first law of diffusion, we'll get to that in upcoming classes. But these then, consider these then are questions, some study questions that you can use as you move forward then into the quiz and into the midterm exam and then general, okay? So with that, I would like to then kind of end at least my formal introductory lecture here.